Dr. Joe Tafur is an integrative family physician, curandero, author, and speaker. He was the co-founder of Ni Hao Rao, Amazonian Plant Medicine Center, and is the author of The Fellowship of the River, a medical doctor's exploration into traditional Amazonian plant medicine. Welcome to the Third Wave Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Austin, here to bring you cutting-edge interviews with leading scientists, entrepreneurs, and medical professionals who are exploring how we can integrate psychedelics in an intentional and responsible way for both healing and transformation. It is my honor and privilege to bring you these episodes as you get deeper and deeper into why these medicines are so critical to the future of humanity. So let's go and let's see what we can explore and learn together in this incredibly important time. Hey listener, we have great news. Third Wave is rolling out another microdosing experience program, a live 6-week group coaching program that uses microdosing and intentional ceremony as tools for accelerated growth. We guide you through 2 weeks of preparation, a breakthrough ceremony, and 4 weeks of microdosing to elevate your mood, reduce your anxiety, and help you feel a deeper sense of connection to those around you. Spots for the program are limited to 50 people, and our next cohort begins Sunday, October 4th. If you're interested in more details, go to our homepage, click Academy, and click Microdosing Experience. We've also linked to it in the show notes of this episode. Third Wave's podcast is brought to you by Magic Mind, called Silicon Valley's new morning elixir by Forbes. Do you want more creativity, flow, and energy in your day-to-day routine? Then go to magicmind.co and get the 2-ounce shot that contains 12 magical ingredients scientifically designed to improve your productivity. I've been using Magic Mind over the last couple months to reduce my morning coffee, and it works like a charm. With matcha, lion's mane, and several other nootropics, it lifts you up and doesn't burn you out. So if you're interested in Magic Mind, go to magicmind.co and enter promo code THIRDWAVE to get 10% off your first order. Hey listeners, and welcome back to the Third Wave Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Paul Austin. And man, these episodes just continue to get more and more interesting and exciting. So, little quick story for you all. Back in October 2016, I traveled to the deep Amazon, to Rio Branco, where there was an ayahuasca conference, the Global Ayahuasca Conference hosted by ICers. And this was one of many journeys that I had in 2016. It was more or less the year that I was like, let's go to every psychedelic conference I can. So I went to Tepoztlán in Mexico. I went to the Global Ibogaine Conference. In September, I flew to Prague to Beyond Psychedelics. I then flew from Prague to New York to go to Horizons. And then from New York all the way down to the Amazon. I had never drank ayahuasca at this point. This was almost 4 years ago now. But having just recently started the Third Wave at the time, less than a year ago, I was really interested in all these sort of emerging and crossover paradigms that were and continue to occur in the space. And one evening there, I had a chance to go out to dinner with some of the other folks who were attending the conference. I basically didn't know anyone previous to going and just happened to sit down next to Dr. Joe Tafur and heard a little bit about his story and what he was up to. We talked. We had a great time. And then, we went our separate ways, and I hadn't really spoken to him in many, many years. And then we recently at Third Wave brought on a phenomenal copywriter who's been writing some of our promo sequences, who's helping write our sales page. His name is Jeff Kimes. And Jeff just happened to know Dr. Tafur from his interactions in the plant medicine space. So Jeff reintroduced me to Joe. Joe and I made a date, I think this was in May of 2020, post-COVID, to hop on Zencastr and record an audio, record a podcast. And what I love about Joe is not only does he have a rigorous education in allopathic medicine, but he also spent considerable time in the Amazon as an apprentice, training to be a curandero. In fact, he co-founded Ni Hao Rao, an Amazonian plant medicine center in Peru. So when I had my first deep ayahuasca experience, this was for 2 straight weeks at the beginning of 2019, For one of those weeks, I went to Soltara Healing Center, where Joe Tafur is a medical advisor. And throughout that week, I read Joe's book, The Fellowship of the River, which is a phenomenal read. I highly recommend it. And what Joe does such a great job of is integrating the known from allopathic medicine, the reductionist approach of what is so beautiful about current medical science and the scientific method that's integrated into it. And what does the unknown teach us? What does the mystery, what does spirit teach us? And how can these two worlds combine to help create an integrated approach to healthcare? So we had a chance to sit down, talk about Joe's personal journey with ayahuasca, with modern medicine, healing from pharmaceuticals, talking about his own healing journey with plant medicine, and just getting a chance to really drop in to listen to one of the leaders in the integration of spirit and science for the sake of healing. So without any further ado, I bring you Dr. Joe Tafur. Hey, listeners, I'm back with the Third Wave Podcast, and I'm sitting virtually across from Dr. Joe Tafur. Dr. Joe, I just want to welcome you to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
What I love to start a lot of these interviews with is a pretty simple question, and that's just, what inspired you to become involved with psychedelic medicine and plant medicine generally?
For me, what inspired me to get involved with psychedelic or plant medicine or sacred plant medicine, and subsequently some psychedelic research and things like that, was getting depressed in medical school. You know, I was just kind of struggling in medical school and having a hard time. I was also exposed to a friend of mine that was trying to get into psychedelic research, like in this renaissance of the clinical research with psychedelics. This was like in 2000, 2001. A good friend of mine wanted to get his MD, Ptsd in psychedelics. So he was exposing me to like this new round of research and kind of medical promise. And that was kind of opening my mind. I was a little fearful. I wasn't so into psychonautics and things like that. And then I actually tried antidepressants for a little bit because my dad was a psychiatrist, and I actually found it helpful, but I was also reading and learning about all this crossover between the antidepressants and kind of serotonergic agents and the psychedelics. And this antidepressant made me feel a little bit, it kind of, I don't know, I'm a sensitive person. I felt a little bit like I was on a little bit of mushrooms. I had tried that a few times. And then I also had a little like jaw tension that reminded me I had tried MDMA a couple times. And so then I was like, wow, I already feel like I'm doing so-called drugs. So why don't I go back to something that I'm more interested in? I was more interested in something more natural from nature. So I went back to Arizona, where I'm from, and I explored an opportunity to enter peyote ceremony. And I had a really profound healing in that ceremony, and it really turned me on and excited me to sacred plant medicine. So after that, I wanted to learn more and more. And that's how I got involved.
And so what happened after that? So you're in medical school, and I had read Fellowship of the River, which we'll get into a little bit later on in the interview, and read that you were, burnt out and under a lot of stress, and, like all medical students are. And then you find out about psychedelics and plant medicine through a friend of yours. You go ahead and have a profound peyote ceremony and experience. What shifted from that experience? And what did that lead you into?
The main shift was it was a one night experience. So yeah, my book is about that. It's about my journey into plant medicine, and then it goes on and we'll get into it. That night, I just felt like before that in medical school, I had just become so lost in my thoughts and in my head. And like I said, I had such a difficult time, I felt, connecting to my own feelings. How did I really feel about things in my heart? And I felt like that was getting shut down in the training process that I was in. I felt like I was getting disconnected from a lot of things that I had felt connected to previously that I felt like were very important to me, namely, to nature, to spirituality, and to people. It was a difficult start. I was uncomfortable physically with the peyote and a lot of gut turmoil. But there was a shift. There was a moment when I just realized, oh my God, my internal dialogue had stopped. I was no longer thinking. And I was just kind of came into my awareness in a very kind of unadulterated way. In that space, I was just able to connect to my senses, to the outside world, and also inward to my own heart and my own feelings, and trying to get a sense of how do I really feel about things instead of like how do I think I feel about things. And then that kind of really blossomed into just feeling like a spiritual connection. And then, with the kind of in the context of nature. So just a real like sense of belonging in place in the universe, and a peace in my mind, and kind of like a new opportunity to find hope, through an open mind and an open heart. That I just couldn't really feel into my heart space, I feel like, and my mind was just cluttered and overtaken, and I could not have enough peace of mind just to sit and look and try to see like what's actually happening right now. And that experience was very, very magical for me and inspiring. It inspired me, and I felt kind of like inspiration. I felt like energized from feeling connected. And so that was really wonderful. And so after that, I it gave me enough strength to continue on. And I continued. I finished medical school. I went to residency, and then in residency, I was more. It was a different scene. It was more active. We were helping patients. We're in the hospital. We're working. It wasn't just this indoctrination process and all the kind of weird, disturbed elements. It was more about being useful and helping people, and it wasn't so difficult for me to engage in that. But I went back. And I did peyote a few times during that process, during my residency. And I also sat in on a Native American church ceremony that was separate, different from what I had experienced before in a spirit walk where you just do it alone.
Like a vision quest.
A vision quest of sorts. It's called the Spirit Walk. It's at the Peyote Way Church of God. It's a certain kind of ceremony that they run there, where it is you go and you have to get to know them and make an appointment. You arrive on their property, which is really remote, out in a big, big desert, and it's a very sacred space that they kind of maintain. And then you fast for 24 hours, and the following night, then you go out into like a little campsite that they set up for you to have the experience. So that's that. But the Native American church ceremony is, within the tribes, they've developed this format where it's in a teepee, and there's a roadman or there's someone leading it. A medicine person is leading the ceremony. And so you have, there's pros and cons, but you have this person, and I got to witness somebody like working with the energy and the plant medicine in what looked like a shamanic, way. I got really curious about that. I was interested. I felt kind of like it felt familiar to me. And my family's from Colombia, and so I knew about ayahuasca. I knew that yahe in Colombia or ayahuasca in Peru was out there, and I knew that more and more people were going to Peru, and I started wanting to go, at some point. And I started becoming very curious about that.
You came from from what I understand, a more traditional medical background. You were in traditional medical school. And then all of a sudden, because of this depression that you're going through and feeling burnt out, you start to work with peyote and you go with the spirit walk and you're starting to learn more about the shamanic practices. I'd be curious just from a medical perspective and, your own personal perspective, what are some of the fundamental differences between the Western medical model and how it treats illnesses versus the more shamanic model and how it treats disease or illness?
First, there's a fundamental similarity, which is, like I say in my book, there's really only one medicine, the one that heals. So in a practical sense, they're very similar in the sense that you're trying to help someone through illness or suffering or whatever it is they're struggling with. So they actually have a lot in common there. But the modalities, like what was missing and what I see for a lot of people, that they struggle sometimes in the Western medical system, allopathic medical system, because there's the emotional and spiritual dimensions of illness are often neglected or overlooked. Like, in other words, what role do your emotional experiences of your life, or let's say your childhood or trauma, et cetera, play in your mental health and even some physical health problems? Is that considered? And the reason that's important, and then spiritual, like how do you feel about yourself? What do you feel like is meaningful and significant for you, at a deep personal level? And is that being addressed in your life? And could that be affecting your health? Some dissonance there. The reason that's such an important thing, when I started going down to Peru and getting exposed to what Shipibo shamans, Shipibo healers, Shipibo curanderos were doing in Peru, I witnessed them healing and kind of having success with a lot of people that I knew were struggling with their medical care, previously, that they had already been going to the doctor or the psychologist or whatever it was. As I mentioned in my book, they spend a lot of money trying to solve problems, but it wasn't not until they encountered a cultural system, a healthcare system that addressed them at a kind of deep emotional and spiritual level that they made progress. So, for me, that's an important thing, because there are certain problems that unless you address the emotional health, the emotional being, and the person does not improve. That doesn't have to be limited to, and it is not limited to, Shipibo, traditional plant medicine. That same approach is used in many contexts. So the important part is that you need to find some kind of modality that is going to address those elements. You don't need to do psychedelics. You don't need to do sacred plant medicine, but you may need to really find a healing modality that's going to help you address like yourself at a deep emotional and spiritual level to heal from certain problems, especially if those problems are rooted in trauma.
Usually those healing modalities are in some way tied to an altered state, right? Whether that's fasting or whether that's drumming or whether that's breath work. Yoga has been used in that way for thousands of years. So I think, there's that far-reaching commonality that altered states place us outside of these egoic structures, which allows us to have more perspective. It's sort of like the things that we keep stuffed away in the basement for a long time in the unconscious and subconscious can finally surface and become integrated.
We could call it like, altered states and is one, or you could call it like a spiritual perspective. In other words, some kind of spiritual perspective on your life that maybe an altered state is what allows you to achieve that spiritual perspective. Sure. And there are other people that are able to kind of achieve such a perspective, I guess in their normal waking consciousness. There's both elements, but I guess it's like in the bridge work, trying to find the bridge work for people to understand that this is a universal thing. It is true that many, many people, especially in this culture, like they've only experienced that kind of consciousness through certain altered state experiences. But there are other people from other cultures that have, that haven't required that. The issue is that if you're from a certain kind of culture where maybe your family and the people you're around, and there's just that altered state consciousness is not accessed until, let's say, they try a psychedelic drug and then they think, oh my God, this is it. Like everybody needs to do psychedelics because then they're going to find the altered state. When it's like, well, maybe for you, yeah, but it's just there. I just think there's many, many ways, for people to access spirit. But of course, I'm deeply involved with plant medicine work, and it is a very interesting way, and so I think there needs to be space for altered states.
Speaking about that bridging concept, I think you as an individual are great, particularly the retreat center that you were involved with in Peru, your new Modern Spirit project in terms of epigenetic research for the MAPS phase 3 trials. You really are building that bridge between, modern medical science and what you're calling the spiritual perspective.
And that's what I was getting at with you a little bit, is just there's kind of like this polarity, this polarity of like, okay, well, there's the allopathic side, and then there's, shamanic. And then there's the muggles, just the whatever, the normal, the system, and then there's altered states. And so that polarity is like, naturally for me, like I'm trying to be a bridge. So I'm trying to put things in terms because, I have a little YouTube that I just put up, and I don't know, I'm trying to promote it all the time, but it's called Spiritual Healing Love Science. It's just a 50-minute talk it's some of the ideas and concepts of the book, but it's trying to talk about like a larger perspective. That's why I like the spiritual perspective, because we don't have to limit the discussion. First, there's everything. And so now, just because we run into some like compartmentalized or limited understanding about this or that, doesn't mean we can't talk about it. And so it's like there are strange things that happen. There are extraordinary things that happen to us. There are things that we experience in our lives that we don't understand. And we know that, for example, like our emotional experiences, which, it could be described without necessarily having all the mathematics, but, that there's an energetic sense to them, that you feel the energy, you feel something move through your body, and your emotional being and your emotional body. And so that's part of our lives, that there's an energetics to our experience, to the way our body responds, the way that influences our awareness. And we know that, really intense emotional experiences, like they end up being very significant for people, and they feel them very strongly in their bodies. And so that's something, when you look at like for example, just to touch briefly on the Epigenetics project. So you have people that are in this Mdma assisted psychotherapy trial. These are the MAPS phase 3 trial. So these people are getting Mdma assisted psychotherapy for treatment resistant Ptsd. So they've had the average, what I read was, 17 to 18 years average of treatment resistant Ptsd. They've tried many treatments and failed many treatments. And now they've had it for nearly 2 decades. Then they go through this intervention, which is a 12-week intervention, which involves 3, MDMA sessions according to their protocol. And after that 12 weeks, 1 year follow-up, almost 70% of them don't have PTSD anymore. So that is a remarkable transformation and a really big breakthrough in psychiatry and in medicine in general. And for the individuals, of course, a humongous shift in their lives. That's a pretty big deal that they had this thing that was so stable in them for, let's say, nearly 2 decades. And now it's cleared up. And we know that there's like a physiologic component to PTSD. It's studied at the physical level, at the way it affects the brain and neural imaging, the way it affects your nerves and, these people's fight or flight systems and their hormone and the cortisol levels and the inflammation in their blood, that all those things we know are very related to the way that stress affects their body. And we also know that the source of that problem was some kind of trauma. There's not really a lot of debate about that. Something really imprinted their system, an event, an experience. Let's say, was it, war, or let's say sexual abuse, something like that, or recurrent stress, recurrent trauma. And that somehow imprinted their system and stabilized. And so then they're frozen in trauma, frozen in the past. They react to, the Vietnam vet reacts to a news helicopter flying overhead as if he was back in the war, triggered into the past. So it's very difficult to be present and maintain a present, awareness. And so then something is released, resolved, healed, therapized in this process. And now they don't have that kind of response anymore. So from the shamanic perspective in Peru, they talk about that in terms of energy. The energy of the trauma, needs to be purged, released, needs to be transformed, and, also healed to whatever degree possible to increase the resiliency of the system, or the resilience of the system. And so my experiences in ayahuasca and my experiences watching people heal, and a big theme of the book and what I talk about is these energies that I was learning about how to help people with through shamanic techniques and help people release, that a lot of times it had to do with helping them overcome emotional trauma. There's other energies, there's other factors, but that was a major one, and that releasing the energy of those traumas and transforming it and healing it and forgiving and all these deep personal processes, they allowed for something to be released, or transformed or changed. And the ayahuasca and this experience that I had, encouraged me to focus on the epigenetics. And so then as I did more research about epigenetics, it was definitely like a part of the biology of the system that affects the way our genes are expressed without changing the DNA code itself. So a very deep level of our biology. But like I say in the book, it's a software, not a hardware. It's a programming. So that there's certain ways that we're programmed. Our genes are expressed a certain way. And so we know that deep emotional trauma can affect us epigenetically, and major stress can. And we're learning that can alter people at an epigenetic level and alter the way, for example, their cortisol receptors that, are on cells to receive and respond to cortisol, that would be epigenetically affected, modulated in a person that has PTSD, and that would be linked to their symptoms. As we learn more, then we're like, wow, okay, so maybe that's where that's where part of it is stored at the cellular level. And could it be changed? Could it be shifted? And we learn there's some psychotherapy research that shows, psychotherapy can lead to changes in epigenetics. And then meditation can lead to changes in epigenetics. And we know that relationships really influence people's epigenetics. And so then I was really curious about, wow, I wonder if the shamanic healing that we're doing in Peru with ayahuasca and with the songs and everything could affect people at the epigenetic level. And then we kind of realized that the MAP study was going on and they were getting these amazing results. And this would be an ideal place to look into that. So we've started the Modern Spirit Epigenetics Project, and we're collecting saliva samples on people going through their trial that eventually we're going to analyze and see, did they shift at this epigenetic level? And is that perhaps linked to their trauma? And is a shift there perhaps linked to their trauma healing and linked to what we would call in the shamanic world, the energy that's being shifted inside them, where the story of this trauma may live, at least in part, in their cells. That's an example of the bridge work. But, in that sense, if we were able to understand things at that level, the shaman, which I already have had this experience, would agree with the Western person as far as hey, this is how we need to heal this person. We need to heal them at this core level. And, when the healing is complete, I think we could both appreciate the shift inside of them, subjectively from what they report and also from what we observe, and maybe even at the epigenetic level in some cases. And that's something that both sides would agree on. We're just finally getting to that degree of science where we could explore things at that level, the subtle, very subtle aspects of ourselves.
An element of precision comes out of that. And that, of course, is the benefit to the allopathic medicine approach is it has the potential and the ability to be very, very precise.
That's right. It does. And sometimes, that precision can be overly precise in the sense that it doesn't tell the whole story. It also this trying to balance it again, is have the precision to really to note this amazing, like you said, a molecular change, incredible. But then also to remember that that's part of a process that is, magically, quantum, physically, whatever, miraculous.
Because you're a medical doctor and you're very well versed in the physiological elements of ayahuasca, this is written about in Fellowship of the River, physiologically how ayahuasca is healing us. I'd love if you could just give a brief overview of when we're going down to Peru, or going to a retreat center in Costa Rica, or going to, it might be a weekend retreat in the United States. What is physiologically going on in that ayahuasca experience that's helping us to heal? And how does that relate to what's going on with the MDMA therapy? Because they're two obviously very, very, very different experiences. And what's true about them is if you have prep and integration, they both can be equally healing for things like PTSD or addiction or depression.
I mean, ayahuasca is a very complicated, substance chemically. And so we don't understand all of the physiologic, effects that it has on the body. We know that, a lot of attention has been put towards the DMT, which is in the chacruna leaves and the particular type of ayahuasca that the Shipibos drink. Obviously, it's a psychedelic and hallucinogenic, as some people might say, but it has a very intense effect on people and can open visionary states that can open mystical experiences. So that's a whole other ball of wax. Once we've allowed that to be there, it's we don't have all the facts on that. There's a lot of mystery involved. But there's certain serotonin receptors that are known to be the 2A, I think, receptors, and maybe they're learning more about other ones that are particularly important in such a visionary experience and are known to be triggered by other psychedelic substances. So that's that element. There's the harmines. There's the ayahuasca vine that has all these, they call harmala alkaloids, these different harmines that have their own properties that may be involved and would make people sick and make people purge, but also are known to being studied for their antidepressant effects and for their effects on neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. So helping our brains change. So there's some of the things in the psychedelic kind of altered state. A big focus has been on this, the way it's changing your neural networks, the way your brain is operating. And so that these mystical experiences are sometimes, before that happens, perhaps there is a shift, this default mode network in the brain that maybe is overactive in overthinking, ruminating kind of modern life, and see it more overactive in depression and anxiety and PTSD, which is really a form of anxiety and addiction, and OCD. That default mode network is quieted, or just the way its function shifts. And that allows people to kind of access their senses in a different way, access their emotional being. A lot of emotional content comes forward, sometimes repressed memories. And then there's this other component that I mentioned before, that sometimes that's associated with some kind of mystical access. So that's some of what we know about the substance. MDMA is different. It's a different substance, has a little different, it is considered psychedelic and has a little bit different physiology. But I think what I am kind of a big proponent of, and there's a conference that's going to be happening in Canada next year, and they were trying to come up with the title, and it was going to be something psychedelic science again. And we were talking about these different perspectives, and I was just really, it's psychedelic assisted therapy, psychedelic assisted medicine. So just MDMA by itself, it's been around in many contexts for a long, long time. People achieving what they're achieving in the MAPS trial is a very refined use of it by people who have really developed themselves to be able to provide that kind of therapy and support. Similarly, at the ayahuasca healing centers, where it's a mixed bag, where there are some people who, could be irresponsible or even predatory, versus people that have really dedicated themselves to refining their own development to be able to provide the kind of support that would really make the difference for somebody, or could help make the difference for somebody. So for me, it's much more about the context and the people that are bringing that context to you. There's a lot to be said about that. And so one of the things that they have in common, and I have been to the training for MAPS and MDMA psychotherapists, is that, and they are not just having any old psychotherapists, as part of the MAPS trial. These are some pretty cream of the crop people. And the ones that I've met are some very spiritually kind of evolved human beings that, really there's a real love and dedication to what they're doing. And so I think that plays a humongous role in the kind of healing they're a part of. And I would say the same thing is true in the ayahuasca scene, that there is a humongous difference when there is that level of dedication and love brought to it. So I would say that's what brings them together, is that there, like you said, there's an altered state experience that helps kind of open things, help people access things, help people reevaluate things, help people, access their feelings and their work through their traumas. But also, like, to be done effectively, there has to be that, to me, is this spiritual context. Like, there has to be a very loving, supportive kind of framework to allow people to kind of transcend any kind of judgment that is going to get in the way of their healing process. And then, like you said, there is the before, the during, and the after, which we call it, they call it set in setting, or they call it the session, and then they call it integration. But here in the community that I'm a part of here in Phoenix, we're kind of learning from some of the Navajo members, the Dene members in our community. Daryl Slim is one of our teachers. And Daryl always says, well, the way they look at it before they do any kind of ceremony, not just plant medicine or let's say peyote, but other forms of ritual and prayer that they engage in, let's say even Vision Quest, for example, which is like more of I did a Vision Quest here, a form of it. And it's like a 4-day, fast out in nature where you're just by yourself and in a little small space, and you just kind of try to be with yourself without any distraction and in the nature and hopefully receive some kind of vision or some kind of experience. So there's the before, what we call set and setting, is like the preparation for the ritual, for the ceremony, for the session. Daryl calls that love. So we come to it with love. That's the way to approach it responsibly. And then the session itself, they call it the gift. What we receive in the session is the gift. And then what we do with that gift, the integration process, they call that the responsibility, of the gift. So I think that when you do all those things, like in Niue Rao and in Peru, the people are doing their healing, what I got exposed to, and that's what I have experience with. I don't have experience with all these other different formats. But, people are going through their healing as part of this, strict people diet. They're in retreat. They're taking a time out. They're integrating as they're there. There's a lot of time for them to reflect on what they're doing. And still, it becomes very important, how they integrate when they get back. What do they do with that gift? How are they able to take care of it? And with what degree of responsibility, and who's guiding them to do that? Who's walking that walk so that they can guide them to do that?
That's a big part of what stuck out to me when reading Fellowship of the River, was how you had walked that walk. And I would love if you could just, tell our audience a little bit about, kind of going back to the beginning of the podcast. You go through these peyote experiences, and sooner or later, I don't know what the timeline was, you find yourself in Peru running an ayahuasca retreat center. I would just love to hear a little bit about, that journey for you. What took you from that medical background into peyote, into running an ayahuasca retreat center? And in particular, in the context of, what we've just now been talking about, how did you walk that walk so that you could facilitate and lead people through that very, spiritual experience?
Right. And so, that's an ongoing process, right? I'm like still learning as a human being many, many things, but still I had to go the preparation to even do it at the level that I'm doing it at now. I told you I was interested in learning more about ayahuasca. My family's from Colombia and I wanted to go. And so I went down there to Peru in 2007, the first time, and to a healing center. And I would just observe this Shipibo style with the Icaros and the songs and the ceremony. And I was looking at the kind of healing that was happening there, as I mentioned, with the kind of problems that I knew that I, as a doctor, I'd been working as a doctor for a little while, or just kind of coming out of my residency, 2006, but, medical school and residency. And then I'm seeing people respond, and they're doing this whole other approach and connecting the dots between, some of this deep emotional trauma and some people's physical symptoms and experience, or at least their mental health problems. And so that kind of really excited me about what they were doing. And I did have some pretty major experiences with the ayahuasca, personally. And I felt very, very like at home with the whole scene and the whole experience. And I kind of like fell in with the shipibos and the shamans. And so I had a very deep personal experience and kind of a sense of belonging that, when I finished that first session there, I was only there for 5 days. I couldn't stop crying, because I just felt like I just felt so at home. And so when I got back, I hadn't told my parents, I'm going down to Peru to drink ayahuasca. But when I got back, I did tell them, because I wanted to let them know that I'm going to go back, I'm not saying, I don't know where this is going, but this is a big deal and I have to go back. And so then I went back and I had even bigger experiences, and I talk about that in the book. And I started learning things about my own family in Colombia and the connection to Amazonian plant medicine. So I kept returning and I kept, learning more and kind of getting exposed and watching people go through the training, realizing they're training foreigners and curious about that. And then over that time, I developed a relationship with Ricardo Amaringo, who's a Shipibo healer, ayahuasquero. And at some point, he wanted to start his own center. And he asked a few people if we would be interested in helping him to do that. And I was, everybody had their own little role and their contribution. And I was a doctor and I spoke Spanish and I was very interested in the plant medicine. So when we were getting along, and he thought that, this would be good. So we had a little team of people and we decided to, at the beginning, it didn't seem like a big deal. It was like, it only cost, it was very cheap to buy the land. So we each put in $600. And I thought, maybe I'll be there like 2 months of the year, And so, because there were multiple people on the team. So I was like, okay, what's the big deal? Not a big risk. And then Ricardo started building the center. And then a lot of the partners dropped out. And then Ricardo said, it's like, hey, we need some money, like we really need some money now because we're really building. And he asked me for $12,000 and I was working as a doctor. And so I gave it to him as a business partner. And we went down, I went down there like that. It was around New Year's and he was building it for real. Like I thought, oh God, he's going to blow the money, it's gone. But he started really building it. And then we had somebody else that was still around to help us kind of manage. And by the time February rolled around, they had enough structures and some more money. And then Svita started, my other business partner, Svita started investing money. And then it was there. And then it was just the three of us, Ricardo, Svita, and I. And then we got started. And then it was like, wow, we're actually going to do this. And there's no other business partner. So either Svita has to be here or I have to be here, like, all year to manage this place and run this place. So that started up. And as I was, we were helping in ceremony, but I hadn't really I'd been through some training over the years leading up to that point, but I hadn't been through the full Shipibo apprenticeship to become ayahuasquero. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do that. That's the traditional way as a diet of 1 year where you're in the jungle and you just basically no sex, no alcohol, no drugs, no red meat, no pork, in this case, no chicken and some strict diets. So only fish, only grilled fish, no fruits or vegetables, or in this way, I had some apples and bananas I wasn't supposed to. And just some starchy stuff, no vegetables, just starchy, rice, plantains, potatoes, lentils, beans, water. That's it. Some people do it very, very strict where they just do plantains and fish. That's it for 1 year, and water. And in that process, the typical dietero goes into isolation and they don't talk to people anymore. And I didn't have that opportunity because I was running the center. So I just didn't know how that was going to fit in. But Ricardo was, pretty adamant. He's like, Joe, you have to do this. Like, you have to train for you to be working alongside me, to help in the ceremony. You have to learn. So he encouraged me, and I was reluctant. And so I ended up breaking it up to like 6 months of a diet while I was running the center, which was very intense and tough, 4 nights a week ceremony, not always drinking ayahuasca, but being there to help all the time. And then I told him, I don't want to do that again. That was like really, really rough. So I broke it up into 3 months and 3 months. And then, I continued dieting after that, like a month here, a month there, just keep accumulating these training periods. But those are the restrictions, which I didn't go into as much isolation as many people have to really get into the deep contemplation. I was working, so I was more doing it in service. So I had to go through that process to demonstrate my commitment and my responsibility, and then to go through my own healing and all the things that are going to come up and that I'm going to have to deal with inside myself and beyond that, to be able to be there for people, so that they, that was another commonality between MDMA psychotherapy and ayahuasca shamanism that I found at one of the training I went to, that one of the head trainers was saying that, when people talk about people being re-traumatized by let's say ayahuasca sessions or ceremonies or MDMA sessions, that she found that was really, although that's a possibility, that one of the major limiting factors was, was the facilitator ready to go there and be there with the person through, come what may. And if they were ready to hold space and guide them and support them through that process, you wouldn't see that, you would see them come through it and work through it eventually. And that was my experience for the most part in Peru. And I feel like, we had to be ready for that. And so we had to go through it ourselves. And in the case of my training, it was like years of working supervised with a bunch of, Shipibo masters and working alongside them in ceremony with all kinds of people, some people with very severe problems. So that was the training process that I went through, after already having become a doctor, which is actually pretty severe.
How did that change then your approach to medicine, going through that entire process?
I mean, I think it changed just like what I talk about in the book. Like the big message of the book is just, the emotional and spiritual dimensions of illness and disease. That's just has become more primary. I mean, I get how, like, if I go do some per diem work as a doctor and go work at urgent care, and it's urgent care, so we're just patching them up and heading them on their way. So we're not going to necessarily get into like all the deeper issues, and maybe it isn't. Maybe they just cut their finger. It's not such a big deal. But when there's other problems, like more chronic health problems, it definitely comes to mind that, like, hey, maybe a deeper healing would be called for. And before I went down there and went through that training, I hadn't seen what such a deeper healing could do for people. So you didn't even think that was a possibility. Like, I think going through normal medical school, my personal impression of like sexual abuse, like of children, was that's, and even severe, rape or even severe PTSD from war, that was considered like, chronic illness. That's not going to get better. And so there's a perfect example, so you're just like, of course you feel bad, but you're not really trying to solve the person's problem because you've never seen the possibility, has never been like illuminated to you that actually can be healed, that some people actually heal from that. And it may not be universally true for everybody, but that there is a pathway and a possibility. But it means, what does it mean? It means addressing some of these very deep, profound things. And like you said, sometimes it involves an altered state, and sometimes it involves this spiritual perspective, but allowing people to work through things at a very deep, profound level. And so that's that's why I listed those cases in my book, was like, here's idiopathic chronic cough, which means this person has a dry chronic cough that we don't know why they have it, and it's not getting better. And so you're just like, oh yeah, I got this dry cough, that's me. And they already ruled everything out, and they had the pulmonary function testing, and they had CAT scan and everything. And they don't have anything that we can identify. It's like, well, what is that? And are they just stuck? Because we now say idiopathic, like that means we don't know what it is. It means we've kind of ruled everything else out, and that's as far as we can help you. It's like, I'm sorry. So that, what does that look like? That looks like you paying a lot of money and going to a lot of doctor visits to just be told like, hey, it's in your head, or there's nothing we can do. And sometimes there is perhaps something that can be done. And in this person's case, it was related to some really deep emotional stuff that once they were able to work through, that eventually resolved. And then I present a migraine headache case, where the person had really significant improvement. And that's not something, as a doctor going through medical school, I never even had that idea that migraine sufferer would just be something that could actually really shift, maybe even go away or heal. Then I present, addiction is in that category for a lot of people. They're not sure that people are actually going to get better from that, but some people do. Then you got PTSD that we mentioned. Then there's depression. Is this just a chronic depression? Is this a biological, biochemical imbalance? Or is it something else? Is it some deep emotional trauma? Is it some ancestral trauma? Is it some epigenetic thing? Is there a way that we can help this person and that they could actually heal and come into more wholeness? And then there's another case, psoriasis, inflammatory skin diseases that we know flare when people have emotional stress. And so is there a way to kind of bring down the threshold within them so maybe they can take a little more stress than they used to take, and the symptoms are not so severe, they don't get as bad. Same thing with Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, one of the cases I presented. So that guy has been going to the doctor all this time, right? They already cut 2 sections of his bowel out, of his intestines out. And me as a family medicine doctor, Crohn's disease, I can't really remember a time when it was presented to me that I should investigate somebody's childhood traumas. Not once. But when I saw what happened to that guy and I started looking it up, I read, oh yeah, actually this discussion has been going on for a long time, this comorbidity in Crohn's disease. And I'm not saying every case of Crohn's disease, but in some people who are not healing and not responding well to treatment, there is evidence that there's increased depression and anxiety, and what's the root of that? And in this guy's case, this deep emotional healing process and whatever, plant medicine process that he went through, dramatic reduction in symptoms. To actually see as a doctor, that's what the book is about. It's like traditional medical doctor's exploration into traditional Amazonian plant medicine. Here's me as a doctor watching these people improve from problems that it was my previous understanding after studying at, a pretty good university in the United States, that was not healable, treatable. Like another really big part of it for me was just also acknowledging and honoring and celebrating, indigenous culture and wisdom and knowledge that these shamans, these healers in the middle of the Amazon knew better in these cases that I presented, that their knowledge deserves a place at the global table, because it helps people. It makes a difference. It deserves respect. Everybody there that got the biggest healing of their life, many of them, yeah, they respect it, but these people are still struggling to be respected within their own countries and in the global scene. And that for me as a Colombian American, that is, it's particularly personal that the indigenous Native American cultures, not just all over the world, but let's say here in the Americas, very, very undervalued, very disrespected. And today's Earth Day, by the way. And so today's Earth Day in the midst of the pandemic, just realizing that there's a lot of, indigenous wisdom for us to draw from. There's a lot of plant medicine out there in the nature that can help us. And even MDMA its origins are from the sassafras tree, saffron oil from the sassafras tree, cooked from the root bark of the sassafras tree and taught to the European settlers by the Native Americans in North America, here in the United States. They never talk about that. Here's another example. I never heard that once in any of my education. Zero. they still don't talk about that. To me, that's really a big issue here on Earth Day, because as we're contemplating, re-examining all our culture, and we're, one of the things people are seeing with all the air is cleaning up and the water's cleaning up is, sustainability. It's so they want to know about sustainable ayahuasca. They want to, are you guys growing enough to keep the supply going, to supply all these people that want to drink ayahuasca? And what about MDMA? Where do they make it from? They say they make it from petrochemicals now, I guess from the oil industry. Okay, is everyone into that? Is that what we want?
No.
Turns out you can make it from plants, and turns out that a lot of people still make it from plants, but since nobody asks or cares where it comes from, because it might as well be whatever, just another product on the shelf.
Because we're so removed from it.
We're so removed from it. You're just like, I just bought some toothpaste and I got some MDMA. But turns out that MDMA that they're doing at Burning Man and they're doing all over the place, they actually do go to international plant sources. And they said they're driving a tree extinct in Cambodia and another one extinct in Venezuela because they still get the saffron oil because it's cheaper for some people to produce it that way versus trying to get it from, petrochemical synthetics. And so it's just, I think Earth Day. And so that's what the plant medicine, movement is very beautiful, because it's just it's a celebration of the earth and the people that have lived on the earth in a sustainable way and the wisdom they can teach us and, hopefully help us to deal with disease. And, you've got Paul Stamets out there in the psychedelic movement talking about the mushrooms and using them for antiviral properties, whether it's for the bees or, there are a lot of people curious, and he's on a paper with the University of Arizona Center for Integrated Medicine for using not psychedelic mushrooms, but all of his other mushrooms for corona, that maybe it helps. And so it's there's another, just everyone's overlooking the mushrooms, and there they are. So, I think it's about bringing nature back into it as much as possible, bringing sustainability into the medicines that we take and put in our bodies.
I'm curious, on this same note, especially as a final question to dig into, we've been talking a lot in this conversation about the relationship between allopathic medicine and the spiritual perspective, the holistic approach, the wisdom that comes from these deep spiritual experiences with plant medicine or altered states or whatever it is, especially from a medical perspective. How do you think the psychedelic renaissance will affect everything that you were just talking about for the last 5 minutes?
It's going to help. It's helping already, The leaders, in what I observe, is that the psychedelic renaissance, which is in the same fashion what we were talking about before, is the big, MDMA for PTSD, MDMA assisted psychotherapy, right? It's not just MDMA. Psilocybin assisted psychotherapy for end of life anxiety, psilocybin assisted therapy for depression, and some other studies that are coming down the line, and Iboga and Ibogaine for opiate withdrawal and addiction treatment, and ayahuasca medicine, and more and more people learning about other plant medicines. They are at the scientific conferences, for example, there's been a lot of discussion around, the treatment and the outcome. And then they started getting into the mystical experience, like Johns Hopkins, these people are having mystical experiences. And then that's really significant. The people who are trying to quit smoking with this psilocybin-based tobacco cessation program, the ones that quit were the ones that had the mystical experience. So that seems significant. And then the group in London, or in, I think, Imperial College, then they're saying, emotional breakthrough. So it wasn't just the mystical experience, but they also had an emotional breakthrough. And so there's a lot of knowledge about what's going on in the experience and what's helping. But then ultimately we're going to get to a point at which, and I think we're on the verge of this point, and my book is very much about this point, is it's time to start talking about what goes on in those sessions. That it's there is a mystery that we are engaging in. And in MDMA psychotherapy, there's a universal love experience that is core to what they're doing. Everybody involved knows that very well, the patients and the therapists. And so it's just like we've been, obviously for strategic reasons, and we don't want to they've been trying to be very strategic to come across the aisle, and make the right moves and to show these clinical benefits, in a randomized controlled trial. And now they have it, now that data is there. And so now it's like, it's time to start talking about what happened to people in there. And I think that's where the discussion starts to open up. That this healing that people are having and the shift that they're having does involve them being more open. And it does help them access more, of themselves. And many of them describe a mystical access, increased intuition, increased creativity, from this healing process. And so all that kind of stuff, it starts to bridge it. And so the ultimate bridge point for me, and that's what, my message is about a lot in my community here in Phoenix, is trying to promote. We have like Church of the Eagle and the Condor. We have a little spiritual community. We got a Facebook. People are putting prayers on the Facebook today. But is this message that I think is rooted for me, and my exposure to was through Native American tradition, is that spirituality and health are the same thing. That the entire purpose of spiritual practice is to nourish your spiritual well-being. It's not for other things. It's not for some political movement. It's not to be part of the right club or to do what this person tells you to do or to shame yourself. It's actually, its origins are to nourish your spiritual well-being. And so now we have a little more guidance about, what's ethical, because we can talk about it in terms of our health. That health is about being in right relationship with yourself, with your body, with your intimate loved ones, with your community, with your society, and with your ecosystem, and with your understanding of, the universe. And so if your practices, spiritual practices or medical practices, don't acknowledge those relationships, they may not be healthy. They may not be ethical along the same lines. And so that's really important, because it opens a door towards a universal spirituality that is about healing and wholeness. And so that bridges, our physical health, our emotional health, our spiritual health, our mental health, our community's health, our ecosystem's health, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's what it has the potential to do, what we're learning from psychedelic healing. Because psychedelic healing, by its nature, is like extremely open-minded. It's a profound openness. It's just sitting there at the center of it.
Beautiful. Wow. Thank you, Joe.
You're welcome.
That was just a fantastic way to wrap this, because everything in terms of an integration of what we've spoken about through the podcast, it is that, like you were saying, the polarity, and when we can bring those polarities together, both the allopathic and the spiritual perspective, and through the vehicle of the psychedelic renaissance, that's where the sense of becoming whole becomes way more accessible for way more people.
Yeah.
Because we've been so disconnected, not only from source, but largely from the earth, which is source in many ways. We feel this existential distress, which leads to disease.
Yeah.
And we finally have the chance, through plant medicines and through breath work and through community and through, these new religions, if you will, these new narratives around what it means to be spiritual, to finally heal that sort of that rotting thing that's been inside us as a culture for many, many years, especially as a Western, from a Western perspective.
Well, and to put it simply, to help people heal their families. Simple as that. That's it. That they're going to be able to raise their children in a more conscious way, in a more loving way, and try to heal the trouble and their other relationships. So like really bringing it home. So I just want to plug for a second, just the...
Oh yeah, I was going to ask you, the book, the project you're working on, and then any other sort of like, if you have a website or anything like that.
Right, sure. So first is Modern Spirit Epigenetics Project. So we are still, we've collected saliva through the Mdma trial, and we're still collecting. But then we're moving to the next phase of the trial, which is the laboratory analysis with the epigenetics, trying to explore where spiritual and emotional healing touches the flesh. So that's expensive. These labs are not it's new laboratory stuff, the precision we talked about. So we have a crowdfund. You can access it through modernspirit.org. That's our Modern Spirit's a nonprofit. That's our website, and you can find the crowdfund there. And then you can also, I have another website, drjoetafur.com, where it describes my activities, and if the travel bans don't keep happening, maybe I'll take some people to Peru this summer. And I'm also part of a clinic in Phoenix, Ocotillo Center for Integrative Medicine, and do some telemedicine stuff there. I have a little mini podcast, the Modern Spirit Podcast. I have a few episodes there. So that's some of the things I'd like to mention. But please help us with the study. Get some people to donate to the study. We're almost there, but we need some more help.
How much do you have left?
Well, we're really, on the crowdfund, it says 200,000. We're over 70. If we were able to get another, 50 to 70, we're hoping for anywhere from 50 to 70,000 more dollars to double where we are. That would be enough.
Great. Well, we'll include links to that in the show notes as well. So as people are listening to the podcast, if you go to the Third Wave, you can see all the show links for that. Joe has also mentioned the URLs. So Dr. Joe Tafur, I just want to thank you again for coming on the podcast and sharing, all of your wisdom with us.
Thank you very much, Paul.